The mountain peak rose like a cathedral spire against the black Afghan sky, its slopes glazed with ice that reflected the pale moonlight. Wind howled through the ravine below, carrying flurries of snow that stung exposed skin like tiny needles. Captain Arya Hale crouched behind a boulder outcropping, her breath forming ghostly plumes in the sub-zero air. Through her night vision scope, she watched the compound 200 meters downslope, where American hostages had been held for 17 days. SEAL Team 12 moved in, practiced silence through the darkness, shadows among shadows. Lieutenant Derek Mason led the point element, his hand signals precise and economical. Behind him, Chief Petty Officer Brandon Wolfe and Petty Officer First Class Jake Mercer covered the flanks while 3 more operators swept the rear. They had trained for this mission profile 100 times, but actual combat always carried variables that no training could predict. Arya shifted her weight, feeling the familiar ache in her left shoulder where shrapnel still lived beneath the skin. 3 years ago, she had been Night Wraith, the most lethal sniper in Joint Special Operations Command. 63 confirmed kills across 4 continents, including a shot at 1,400 meters through a sandstorm that military instructors still taught as impossible. Then came the mission in Syria, where her spotter, Sergeant Thomas Brighton, died because she had called the wrong target priority. She could still hear the explosion, still see his body launch through the air like a broken doll. She had resigned 48 hours after his funeral, despite protests from her commanding officers. The nightmares made sleep impossible. The guilt made living nearly as difficult. For 3 years, she had worked as a private security consultant, training others but never pulling a trigger herself. When JSOC requested her services for this hostage rescue due to personnel shortages during the holiday season, she had agreed only because they promised her role would be strictly advisory, observation, and intelligence only. But the mountain had other plans. Mason's voice crackled through the encrypted radio net. Overwatch, this is ground element. We have visual confirmation on the hostages. 3 individuals. Appears they're mobile. Compound security is lighter than expected. 6 guards visible. Arya pressed her transmit button. Copy, ground element. Thermal scans show 12 heat signatures total in the compound. 6 more are inside the main structure. Wind is gusting northwest at 15 knots. Recommend you adjust approach vector. Roger that. Overwatch. She watched through her scope as the SEAL team adjusted their formation, moving like water around obstacles. They were good, very good, but something gnawed at the edge of her consciousness, a premonition she had learned never to ignore during her operational years. The compound was too quiet, the guards too relaxed. The whole setup felt wrong, like a stage set waiting for actors to enter. Then she saw it through her thermal optics, movement in the ridgeline 300 meters north of the SEAL's position. Multiple heat signatures, at least 20, maybe more, spreading out in a tactical formation that spoke of professional military training. This was not a ragtag militia. These were soldiers, well-equipped and disciplined. Ground element, Overwatch. Her voice cut through the radio net with urgent precision. Abort! Abort! You have hostile forces moving to your north. Estimate 24 plus. This is an ambush. I repeat. This is an ambush. Mason's response came immediately. Copy, Overwatch. Breaking contact now. But it was already too late. The night erupted with muzzle flashes from 3 directions simultaneously. The ambush had been perfectly coordinated. Whoever planned this had known the SEALs were coming and had prepared a kill box designed to trap them in the narrow ravine with no cover and no escape routes. Arya watched in horror as tracer rounds drew burning lines through the darkness, converging on the SEAL team's position. Explosions bloomed orange and red as rocket-propelled grenades impacted around them. She could hear the staccato bark of automatic weapons fire, the deeper boom of grenades, the sharp crack of high-velocity rifle rounds passing close overhead. Ground element taking heavy fire. Mason's voice remained steady despite the chaos she could hear in the background. We have 3 wounded, need immediate case vac. Attempting to reach the rally point, Arya was already moving, abandoning her observation post and racing down the mountainside toward the firefight. Her advisory role had just ended. These men were going to die unless someone intervened, and she was the only one in position to help. Blood pounded in her ears, matching the rhythm of her boots against frozen stone. She had sworn she would never fight again, never put herself in a position where her decisions could cost another teammate their life. But some oaths were meant to be broken when honor demanded it. The enemy had chosen their ambush site with ruthless efficiency. The ravine funneled the SEAL team into a natural kill zone barely 50 meters wide, with steep walls on both sides and no cover except scattered boulders that offered inadequate protection against the volume of fire being directed at them. Arya slid behind a rock formation at the southern edge of the firefight and assessed the tactical situation with the cold clarity that had made her legendary. The hostile force was not some poorly trained insurgent group. These fighters moved with coordinated discipline, maintaining proper spacing and fire control. They had modern optics, night vision capabilities, and were employing suppressing fire while maneuvering elements attempted to flank the trapped SEALs. Worse, she spotted a quadcopter drone hovering above the battlefield, its thermal camera no doubt feeding targeting data to the enemy commander. Through the chaos, she located the SEAL team pinned down behind an outcropping of volcanic rock about 80 meters from her position. Mason was barking orders, while simultaneously applying pressure to Chief Wolf's leg wound. 2 other operators were down, one motionless, the other clutching his abdomen and clearly in shock. The remaining SEALs were returning fire, but they were running low on ammunition and had no way to break out of the kill box. Arya raised her M4 rifle and began engaging targets, her muscle memory taking over despite the 3-year absence from combat. Double tap, shift aim, double tap again. 2 enemy fighters dropped before the others realized they were taking fire from an unexpected direction. The momentary confusion bought the SEALs precious seconds to reposition. Overwatch, is that you laying down fire from the south? Mason's voice carried a note of desperate hope. Affirm. I'm moving to your position. Keep their heads down. She sprinted across open ground, knowing that every second of exposure could be her last. Bullets whined past her, striking sparks off stone. A rocket-propelled grenade detonated 10 meters to her left, the concussion wave slamming into her like an invisible fist. She felt something wet and hot spray across her face and realized shrapnel had opened a gash above her right eyebrow. Blood immediately began streaming into her eye, blurring her vision. No time to stop. Keep moving. She dove behind the boulder where Mason had established his defensive position, landing hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. The SEAL lieutenant looked at her with surprise that quickly shifted to grim determination. Didn't know advisory personnel were authorized to join the party, he said, his attempt at humor falling flat in the circumstances. I'm revising my job description. Arya wiped blood from her face and performed a rapid assessment of their situation. 3 SEALs down, 4 still combat effective, but running low on ammunition. No functioning long-range communications due to electronic jamming. The enemy was preparing for a final assault. She could see them massing for a coordinated push. Another rocket exploded nearby, showering them with rock fragments and frozen dirt. The blast wave lifted Arya off her feet and slammed her against the boulder with bone-jarring force. She felt something snap in her left ribs, a sharp lance of pain that made breathing difficult. When she tried to stand, her legs wouldn't quite cooperate. The world tilted sideways, and she realized she was going into shock from blood loss and trauma. Through blurring vision, she saw Mason trying to establish radio contact with anyone who might send help, but the jamming was too effective. They were alone on this frozen mountain with at least 40 enemy fighters closing in for the kill. The wounded SEALs wouldn't last another 10 minutes. Hell, none of them would last another 10 minutes at this rate. Arya felt consciousness starting to slip away. That seductive darkness that promised an end to pain. It would be so easy to just stop fighting, to let go, to join Thomas Brighton wherever dead soldiers went. She had carried the guilt of his death for 3 years. Maybe this was simply fate balancing the scales. Then she heard Chief Wolf groan in pain, heard one of the younger SEALs praying under his breath, heard Mason calling for a corpsman they didn't have. These men had families waiting for them, children who deserved to see their fathers come home. They had done nothing wrong except trust their intelligence and follow their orders. They did not deserve to die in this godforsaken ravine on Christmas Eve because she was too tired to keep fighting. The memory of Thomas's last words echoed in her mind. Don't you quit on me, Arya. Whatever happens, you keep fighting. Promise me. She had made that promise as he died in her arms, blood soaking into the Syrian sand. For 3 years, she had broken that promise by walking away from the fight. Tonight, she would honor it one last time. The world snapped back into focus with painful clarity. Arya forced herself to her knees, then to her feet, ignoring the protest of broken ribs and bleeding wounds. She checked her remaining ammunition. 18 rounds in her M4, 2 magazines left. Not enough to hold off 40 fighters, not even close. But she was not just any soldier. She was Night Wraith, and she had survived impossible odds before by thinking differently than her enemies expected. The key to any battle was not superior firepower, but superior positioning. Right now, she and the SEALs were trapped at ground level, fighting from a position of weakness. The enemy held the high ground, multiple angles of attack, and overwhelming numbers. Time to change the equation. Through blood-hazed eyes, she studied the terrain with tactical intensity. The ravine's southern wall rose nearly 40 meters, a sheer face of ice-covered granite that most people would consider unclimbable, especially at night, in a snowstorm, while wounded. But Arya had graduated from the military's survival, evasion, resistance, and escape course, where she had learned to climb far worse surfaces in far worse conditions. More importantly, that vertical face terminated at a broad ledge that overlooked the entire battlefield. From that position, a skilled marksman could dominate the entire kill zone, picking off targets without fear of return fire from below. It was perfect, if she could reach it without dying in the attempt. The flashback hit her like a physical blow, dragging her back 3 years to that dusty Syrian courtyard. She had been in her hide, tracking 3 high-value targets through her scope. Thomas was beside her, calling wind and distance. She had chosen to engage the leftmost target first, a tactical decision based on threat assessment, but the middle target had been wearing a suicide vest, and when he detonated it, the blast killed Thomas and 2 other operators who had just breached the compound entrance. She had made the logical choice, the tactically sound choice. But logic and tactics had not saved Thomas. Her decision had put him in the wrong place at the wrong moment, and he had paid the price. Since that day, every decision felt weighted with the possibility of catastrophic failure, every choice shadowed by the fear that she would once again send someone to their death through her own error. "Not again," she whispered into the howling wind. "Not tonight. Not ever again." The enemy fighters were advancing now, emboldened by the SEALs' slackening return fire. She could hear their voices calling to each other in Dari, coordinating their assault. They believed victory was inevitable, that they were about to overrun a wounded American Special Operations team and claim a propaganda victory that would resonate across the region. They were wrong. They had made the fatal mistake of not killing her when they had the chance, and now she was going to make them understand exactly why the intelligence community had called her Night Wraith. Ghosts did not die easily, and they certainly did not forgive. Arya crawled to where Mason was frantically trying to control Chief Wolf's bleeding. The SEAL lieutenant looked up at her, his face grim with the knowledge of their approaching end. "How much ammunition do you have left?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pain coursing through her body. "Maybe 40 rounds total across the team, not enough to hold them off much longer." Mason's jaw clenched. "I've got 2 men who need immediate surgery, one who probably won't make it regardless, and no way to call for extraction. We're done." "No," Arya said flatly. "You're not done, but I need you to trust me, and I need you to give me your weapons." Mason stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "Give you our weapons?" "Captain, with respect, you're bleeding from at least 3 wounds and can barely stand. What exactly do you think you're going to accomplish?" She pointed at the vertical rock face. "I'm going to climb to that ledge and establish a sniper position. From up there, I can control the entire battlefield. But I need your MK-13 rifle, all remaining ammunition, your thermal scope, and any smoke grenades you can spare." The SEAL lieutenant followed her pointing finger, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "That's a 40-meter vertical climb on ice-covered rock in the middle of a firefight while you're seriously wounded. Captain, that's not a plan. That's suicide. It's the only plan that keeps you and your men alive." Arya met his eyes with unwavering intensity. "I've made this climb before, on worse surfaces, in worse conditions. I can do it again. But I need that rifle, Mason. Your sidearm is designed for close quarters, not precision fire at extended range. The MK-13 is purpose-built for exactly what I need to do. If you fall, we lose our only sniper-qualified operator and all our best weapons." Mason shook his head. I can't authorize that. You're not authorizing anything. I'm telling you what's going to happen. Arya's voice hardened with command authority that had led men through a dozen combat zones. In approximately 90 seconds, those fighters are going to overrun your position. Your wounded will die first, because they can't fight back. Then the rest of you will be killed or captured, and I promise you, that capture is worse. I have seen what these people do to prisoners. You do not want that fate for yourself or your men. She leaned closer, making sure he could see the absolute certainty in her eyes despite the blood and pain. Or you can give me that rifle and trust that I'm about to remind the enemy why they used to whisper my name in the dark. Your choice, Lieutenant. Make it now. For 3 heartbeats, Mason wrestled with the decision, his tactical training warring against the desperate reality of their situation. Then he reached for the Mark 13 Mod 7 sniper rifle secured across his back, his hands trembling slightly as he unfastened the retention straps. If anyone can pull this off, it would be you, he said quietly, passing her the weapon. The rifle was heavy, familiar, like greeting an old friend she had not seen in years. But Captain, you need to understand something. If you die up there, I will never forgive myself for letting you try. Then I guess I better not die. Arya checked the rifle's action, verified the magazine was seated properly, and adjusted the scope's eye relief. Everything felt right, as if the weapon had been waiting for her to return. She took the 3 additional magazines Mason offered, each loaded with match-grade, 300 Winchester Magnum ammunition designed for extreme-range precision shooting. Petty Officer Jake Mercer, one of the remaining combat-effective SEALs, crawled over with 2 smoke grenades and a thermal imaging monocular. His face was blackened with dirt and cordite residue, but his eyes remained sharp with combat focus. Ma'am, I'm not sure if you remember me, but you taught a precision rifle course I attended 4 years ago at Fort Benning. You told us that the difference between a good sniper and a great sniper wasn't physical skill. It was the absolute refusal to accept defeat. He pressed the equipment into her hands. Don't accept defeat tonight, we need you up there. Arya felt something crack in the armor she had built around herself since Thomas's death. These men believed in her, trusted her, were willing to bet their lives on her ability to accomplish the impossible. That faith was both humbling and terrifying, because faith could be betrayed and trust could be broken through simple human error. But there was no more time for doubt. An enemy machine gun opened fire from the northern ridgeline, tracers stitching across their position. Mason and his remaining able-bodied operators returned fire, but their ammunition situation was becoming critical. The assault would come within minutes, and when it did, no amount of courage would save them from overwhelming numbers. Arya slung the Mk-13 across her back along with her M4, secured the extra magazines in her vest pouches, and clipped the thermal monocular to her helmet. She checked her climbing gloves, making sure they were secure, then looked up at the vertical face she was about to ascend. Ice gleamed in the moonlight, beautiful and lethal. The wind had picked up, gusting hard enough to make the climb exponentially more dangerous. As she moved toward the base of the cliff, Chief Wolf called out weakly from where he lay with his wounded leg elevated. Hey, Captain, when you get up there and start dropping those bastards, save one for me, would you? She looked back at the wounded SEAL, saw the pain in his eyes, but also the defiant humor that kept operators sane in the worst situations. I'll save you too, Chief. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas, Night Wraith. Give them hell. With those words echoing in her ears, Arya began to climb. Her injured left side screamed in protest as she reached for the first handhold, her broken ribs grinding together with every movement. Blood from her head wound dripped steadily, freezing in the sub-zero temperature before it could fall. She ignored the pain through practiced mental discipline, compartmentalizing everything except the immediate task of finding the next grip, the next foothold, the next meter of elevation. The rock was treacherous, covered with a thin layer of ice that broke away under her weight. Twice in the first 10 meters, she nearly fell, saved only by desperate lunges for more secure holds. Below her, she could hear the intensifying firefight as the enemy pressed their assault. Mason and his team were down to their last magazines, firing in controlled bursts to conserve ammunition. At 20 meters up, her left hand slipped. She swung outward, held only by her right hand and the precarious purchase of her boot toes in a narrow crack. For a sickening moment, she hung suspended over empty space, the weight of her weapons and ammunition trying to pull her down. Her shoulder joint screamed as it took her full body weight. Through the pain, she heard Thomas's voice again, that last moment in Syria as his life bled into the sand. "Don't quit on me, Arya. Whatever happens, you keep fighting." With a roar of pure determination, she swung her left hand up and caught a jagged outcropping. Her fingers were going numb from cold, but she pulled herself back against the rock face and continued climbing. 25 meters, 30 meters. The ledge was still 10 meters above, but she could see it clearly now, a natural platform roughly 3 meters wide and deep enough to provide cover from return fire. Then she heard voices directly above her. 2 enemy fighters had positioned themselves on the ledge, using it as an observation post to coordinate their assault. She could see their boots just over the lip of rock, could hear them speaking urgently into radios. If they looked down, they would see her clinging to the rock face like an insect, completely vulnerable. Arya stopped moving, pressing herself flat against the cold stone. Her muscles trembled with exhaustion and adrenaline. Slowly, carefully, she reached for the sidearm holstered at her thigh. A pistol was not ideal for this situation, but she had no other option. If she tried to unsling the rifle while hanging from the cliff, she would certainly fall. One of the fighters above laughed at something his companion said. They were relaxed, confident in their imminent victory, unaware that death hung just below them on the rock face. Arya drew her weapon and thumbed off the safety, then resumed climbing with her left hand while keeping the pistol ready in her right. 3 meters from the top. 2 meters. She could see the fighters clearly now through the darkness. 2 young men in winter camouflage carrying AK-pattern rifles. Neither was looking in her direction, both focused on the firefight below. With her last reserves of strength, Arya pulled herself up and onto the ledge in one explosive movement. The nearest fighter started to turn, his reflexes quick, but not quick enough. She put 2 rounds center mass before his weapon could come fully around. The second fighter managed to raise his rifle, but she shot him through the throat before he could cry out a warning. Both men collapsed without alerting their comrades below. Arya dragged their bodies behind a boulder, then took a moment to orient herself. The ledge was perfect, even better than she had hoped. She had clear lines of sight across the entire battlefield, could see both the trapped SEAL team and the enemy forces massing for their final assault. Wind here was stronger but consistent, which she could compensate for. She unslung the Mk-13, deployed its bipod, and settled into a proper shooting position. Through the rifle's scope, the battlefield resolved into crystalline clarity. She counted 53 enemy fighters, most clustered in 3 main groups, preparing to advance. Their commander was visible near the center group, distinguished by his gestures and the way others deferred to him. Arya's training took over, shutting down unnecessary emotion, focusing her consciousness into the pure mechanics of precision shooting. Range to nearest target, 240 meters. Wind from the northwest at 18 knots, gusting to 25. Temperature, -12 Celsius. Barometric pressure, standard for this altitude. She controlled her breathing, feeling her heartbeat steady into the calm rhythm that had always preceded her most difficult shots. Below, Mason's team had perhaps 30 seconds before they were overrun. She had to disrupt the assault, had to create enough chaos and casualties to break the enemy's momentum. Arya placed her crosshairs on the enemy commander's head. At this range, with this rifle, in these conditions, the shot was well within her capability. But killing the commander first might cause the remaining fighters to scatter or surrender, ending the fight quickly. Or it might enrage them into a suicide assault that would overwhelm the exhausted SEALs before she could kill enough of them. For a fraction of a second, she hesitated, remembering Syria and the choice that had cost Thomas his life. Choose the wrong target priority, and men die. Choose correctly, and men live. The weight of that decision pressed down on her like the cold mountain air. Then she remembered something Thomas had told her during their last training session together. Stop second-guessing yourself, Arya. You have the best tactical instincts of anyone I've ever worked with. Trust yourself. The moment you start doubting is the moment you fail. Arya made her decision. She shifted her aim to the lead fighter in the nearest assault group, a large man carrying a machine gun. Kill him first, disrupt the immediate threat to Mason's position, work outward from there, methodical and efficient. Save the commander for later, once the situation was stabilized. She pressed the trigger. The rifle's report echoed across the frozen mountain like thunder, and the lead fighter dropped instantly, his machine gun clattering against stone. Before his body hit the ground, Arya had already cycled the bolt and was tracking her second target. The fighter beside the first machine gunner turned toward the sound of the shot, confusion clear in his body language. He never understood what killed him. 2 rounds, 2 kills, 4 seconds elapsed. The enemy force erupted into chaos. They had expected the SEALs to be easy prey, trapped and desperate. They had not expected precision rifle fire from an elevated position that commanded the entire battlefield. Fighters scattered, seeking cover, shouting warnings that were both too late and too vague to be useful. Arya continued her methodical work. She had learned long ago that panic was a sniper's greatest ally. Frightened soldiers made mistakes, exposed themselves at wrong moments, forgot their training in the desperation to survive. Each shot she fired amplified their fear, convinced them they were facing an entire platoon of American marksmen rather than one wounded woman on a ledge. Target 3. A fighter attempting to maneuver toward the SEAL position. Dead. Target 4. A radio operator trying to call for reinforcements. Dead. Target 5. A man with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher drawing a bead on Mason's boulder. Dead before he could fire. The enemy commander was screaming orders now, trying to restore discipline. He directed half his fighters to suppress the ledge with automatic fire, while the other half continued the assault. It was sound tactics under the circumstances, but it required his men to expose themselves to implement. Arya capitalized on their movement, dropping 2 more fighters who broke cover too carelessly. Bullets began pinging off rocks around her position as the suppressing fire found its mark. She rolled left, relocated to a new shooting position 3 meters away, and resumed firing before they could adjust. This was the technique she had developed during her operational career, what her instructors called ghost repositioning. Never stay in one place long enough for the enemy to establish effective counterfire. Never establish a predictable pattern of movement. She had fired 18 rounds and achieved 15 confirmed kills. The remaining enemy fighters were now pinned down in a deadly crossfire, caught between the SEALs below and her position above. Mason's team had used the reprieve to reorganize, redistribute ammunition, and establish better defensive positions. She could see the SEAL lieutenant directing his men with renewed energy, no longer fighting just to delay their deaths but actually believing they might survive. Then she heard the distinct whine of a quadcopter drone. The thermal drone she had spotted earlier was now vectoring directly toward her position, its camera undoubtedly transmitting her location to the enemy commander. In seconds, every fighter on the battlefield would know exactly where she was, and then the concentrated fire would become overwhelming. Arya tracked the drone through her scope. It was small, fast, and maneuvering erratically to avoid being shot down. Most soldiers would have found it nearly impossible to hit with a precision rifle designed for long-range accuracy, not aerial targets. But Arya had spent her career making impossible shots, and she had one crucial advantage: patience. She watched the drone's flight pattern, identifying the subtle repetition in its movements. Every 6 seconds, it made the same banking turn to adjust its camera angle. That turn required it to slow slightly, to become predictable for just a fraction of a second. She would have one chance, one shot, because the drone operator would change tactics after the first miss. 5 seconds. 4, 3. The drone began its banking turn. Arya led the target by 3 body lengths, elevated slightly to account for bullet drop at this angle, and pressed the trigger with perfect timing. The .300 Winchester Magnum round struck the drone dead center, and it disintegrated in a shower of plastic and electronics. Below, the enemy fighters reacted with visible shock. Shooting down a fast-moving drone with a precision rifle was not something average soldiers could accomplish. It was the kind of shot that only elite operators practiced, the kind of demonstration of skill that broke enemy morale more effectively than any amount of firepower. Arya allowed herself a grim smile. They were starting to understand what they were facing. The stories about Night Wraith were not exaggeration, not propaganda. She had killed men in a dozen countries, had made shots that defied belief, had survived ambushes and raids and assassination attempts. Tonight, on this frozen mountain, she would add one more legend to her record. But the enemy was not finished. She saw movement on the cliff face below her position, heard the scrape of boots on stone. A 5-man element was attempting to climb up and eliminate her. Using the same route she had taken, They were well-trained and aggressive, exactly the kind of fighters who did not panic under pressure. Arya shifted to her secondary weapon, the M4 rifle, better suited for close-quarters combat. She positioned herself at the lip of the ledge where she could look directly down at the climbers. They were making good progress, working as a team, covering each other's advance. The lead climber was perhaps 6 meters below her position and closing fast. She dropped a smoke grenade over the edge. It detonated halfway down the cliff face, billowing thick gray smoke that obscured the climber's vision and made breathing difficult. While they were temporarily disoriented, she leaned over the edge and engaged them with precise 3-round bursts. The lead climber took rounds through the chest and fell backward into empty space, his body tumbling end over end until it struck the ground with sickening force. The second climber managed to raise his weapon and return fire, forcing Arya to duck back. Bullets chewed into the rock where her head had been an instant before. She pulled a fragmentation grenade from her vest, cooked off the fuse for 2 seconds to prevent the climbers from throwing it back, and dropped it into the smoke cloud. The explosion was muffled by the smoke, but devastating in its effect. When the smoke cleared, 3 bodies lay crumpled at the base of the cliff. The 5th climber had abandoned the ascent and was retreating back toward his comrades, shouting warnings about the demon on the ledge who could not be killed. Arya returned to the Mk-13 and resumed her precision work. The enemy force had been reduced to approximately 35 fighters, and their resolve was cracking. She could see it in their body language, the way they hesitated before moving, the way they looked toward their commander for guidance that was not forthcoming quickly enough. She placed her crosshairs on a fighter, attempting to organize a flanking maneuver, and ended his tactical planning permanently. Then another fighter, and another, each shot carefully aimed, each kill adding to the enemy's demoralization. The snow around her position was littered with spent brass casings, a golden trail of death that gleamed in the moonlight. Her ammunition situation was becoming critical. She had 4 rounds left in the current magazine, 2 full magazines remaining. Perhaps 50 rounds total between the Mk-13 and her M4. Enough to continue suppressing the enemy, but not enough for a prolonged engagement. The enemy commander would eventually realize that if they simply waited, eventually she would run out of ammunition or make a mistake born of fatigue. Time to change the dynamic again. Through her thermal scope, Arya identified the enemy commander sheltering behind a cluster of boulders near the northern ridgeline. He was directing fire through hand signals, trying to coordinate a renewed assault while his fighters were scattered and demoralized. Kill him, and the already fragile enemy cohesion would collapse entirely. But the shot was technically challenging. 830 meters range, significant wind deflection, and the target was presenting only partial exposure. She would need to thread the round between 2 boulders with less than 15 centimeters of clearance on either side, miss by even a small margin, and the bullet would strike stone instead of flesh, alerting the commander to relocate. Arya settled deeper into her shooting position, controlling her breathing until her heartbeat slowed to the methodical rhythm she needed. Pain from her wounds faded into background noise. Cold, exhaustion, fear, all became distant abstractions. There was only the rifle, the target, and the mathematics of death. She adjusted for windage based on the flags of snow blowing across the ridgeline. Calculated bullet drop at this range and altitude, factored in the Coriolis effect and the slight cant of her shooting platform. The commander moved, and she tracked him patiently through the scope, waiting for the moment when his exposure would align perfectly with her firing solution. 3 seconds. 2. The commander leaned out to shout an order, and in that instant, he made the fatal mistake of presenting a clean headshot. Arya pressed the trigger with absolute confidence in her calculations. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the shot echoing across the mountain like a final judgment. Through her scope, she watched the commander's head snap backward, his body crumpling like a puppet with severed strings. For a heartbeat, the battlefield went silent. Then, the enemy force fragmented completely, fighters breaking cover and running for the ridgeline in a panicked retreat. Without their commander, without the cohesion of unit discipline, they had transformed from a military force into a frightened mob. Mason's team capitalized immediately, rising from their defensive positions and engaging the retreating fighters. The SEALs had conserved enough ammunition for one final push, and they used it with lethal efficiency. Caught between the SEAL assault from below and Arya's precision fire from above, The remaining enemy fighters had only two choices: surrender or die. Most chose to run. Arya let them go, focusing her remaining ammunition on the few fighters who tried to maintain the defense. She dropped 3 more before the battlefield went quiet, except for the moaning of wounded and the howl of wind through the ravine. When the last echo of gunfire faded, Arya allowed herself to sag against the boulder. Her entire body trembled with exhaustion and shock. Blood had soaked through her tactical vest, freezing in crystalline patterns. Her broken ribs ground together with every breath, and the head wound above her eye had swollen enough to partially obscure her vision. But they had won. Against impossible odds, in the worst possible circumstances, they had survived and defeated an enemy force more than 3 times their size. The SEALs would go home to their families. They would see another Christmas, another year, another lifetime of memories that had almost been stolen by violence on a frozen Afghan mountain. Through blurring vision, she saw Mason and his team moving across the battlefield, securing weapons and checking enemy wounded. The SEAL lieutenant looked up toward her position and raised his hand in a salute that carried more respect than any medal ever could. She returned the gesture weakly, then closed her eyes and let the rifle slip from her numb fingers. For the first time in 3 years, the weight of Thomas's death did not feel quite so crushing. She had not saved him, could never save him, but tonight she had honored his memory by refusing to let another team die. She had fought when quitting would have been easier, had climbed when falling would have been simpler, had pulled the trigger when mercy toward herself would have been understandable. Night Wraith had returned, and in returning, had perhaps found a measure of redemption. Consciousness returned in fragments, each piece accompanied by new inventories of pain. Arya opened her eyes to find herself being carried down the mountain on an improvised litter. Mason and Mercer taking turns at the corners. Snow fell gently now, the storm having passed, and dawn was beginning to break on the eastern horizon with soft pink light. "Thought we lost you up there," Mason said when he noticed her eyes open. "You collapsed about 2 minutes after that last shot. How are you feeling?" "Like I fell off a mountain," Arya whispered, her voice raw. "How long was I out?" 20 minutes. "We had to climb up to get you, which was not easy given that you made it look simple earlier." The SEAL lieutenant's attempt at humor was undercut by the genuine concern in his eyes. "You've lost a lot of blood, Captain. We've got tourniquets on the worst bleeds, but you need a hospital soon." She tried to sit up, but her body refused to cooperate. Every muscle felt like it had been beaten with hammers, and her broken ribs made even breathing an exercise in managed agony. "The team? The wounded? Chief Wolf is stable, mostly. Thompson didn't make it. Franklin will need surgery, but should survive if we can get him to Bagram in the next few hours." Mason's jaw tightened. "We lost one good man tonight, but without you, we would have lost everybody. So thank you, doesn't really seem adequate, but thank you for not letting us die on this mountain." Arya closed her eyes again, feeling tears she had not shed in 3 years finally breaking through. Thompson. She had not been able to save him, just as she had not saved Thomas. The guilt threatened to overwhelm her, to drag her back into that dark place where failure defined her identity. But then she felt Mason squeeze her shoulder gently. "Hey, Captain, I've read your file. I know about Syria and what happened to your spotter. I know you carry that with you. But you need to understand something. Thompson's wounds were catastrophic, sustained in the initial ambush before you even reached our position. The medics tell me he was probably gone within 5 minutes of being hit. There was nothing you could have done differently that would have changed his fate. But maybe if I had spotted the ambush earlier, if I had warned you sooner." "Stop." Mason's voice carried the firm authority of a combat leader who would not accept self-destructive thinking from his people. "You gave us warning with enough time to prevent total annihilation. You climbed a mountain most people would consider impossible to climb. You eliminated more than 20 enemy fighters from an exposed position while seriously wounded. You saved 7 lives tonight, Captain. 7 men who are going home to their families because of your actions. Don't dishonor their survival by fixating on the one you couldn't save." The words cut through her spiraling guilt like a knife through fog. She had spent 3 years telling herself that Thomas's death invalidated everything else she had accomplished, that one failure erased a career of successful missions. But Mason was right. Thompson's death was tragedy, But it did not negate the 7 men she had kept alive through skill and determination and sheer refusal to surrender. 7, she repeated quietly. I saved 7. Damn right you did. And if anyone ever asks me who the best operator I've ever served with was, I'm going to tell them about the night a wounded sniper climbed a mountain in a blizzard and fought off an entire enemy company by herself. They're going to think I'm exaggerating, but I'll show them the after-action report and the medal recommendation I'm submitting as soon as we're off this rock. Arya felt something in her chest loosen, a knot of guilt and self-recrimination that had been tied tight for 3 years beginning to unravel. She would never forget Thomas, would always carry some responsibility for his death. But perhaps that weight did not have to define the entirety of her identity. Perhaps she could be both a soldier who had failed once and a soldier who had succeeded many times, and perhaps the successes deserved to be weighed alongside the failure. The extraction helicopter arrived as full daylight broke across the mountain. The crew chief helped load the wounded SEALs first, then reached for Arya's litter. She waved him off and managed to stand on her own, determined to walk to the aircraft under her own power. Every step was agony, but she made it to the helicopter's door and collapsed into the troop seat with something approaching dignity. As the helicopter lifted off, she looked back at the mountain where she had fought her last battle. The battlefield was already disappearing under fresh snowfall, nature erasing the evidence of violence with white silence. By tomorrow, no trace would remain of the blood and death that had stained this place. It would be just another mountain in Afghanistan, beautiful and indifferent to human suffering. But Arya would remember. 7 men would remember. Their families would have them home for Christmas because of what happened on this mountain, and that was worth every drop of blood, every moment of pain, every second of terror during the climb and the fight. Chief Wolf, strapped to a litter across from her, managed a weak smile. Hey, Captain, did you save me those 2 kills like I asked? Arya thought about the enemy commander and the climber she had killed in close combat. I saved you 3, Chief. Merry Christmas. Best Christmas present I ever got. Thanks for keeping me alive, Night Wraith. The nickname made her flinch initially, but then she reconsidered. Night Wraith was not a monster or a murderer. It was an identity forged by necessity, by the reality that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was through highly trained violence delivered with precision and purpose. She had tried to leave that identity behind after Thomas's death, but perhaps it was not something that could be abandoned so easily. Perhaps it was simply who she was, for better or worse. A weapon aimed at the wicked, a shield for those who could not defend themselves, a ghost who walked between the worlds of civilization and warfare to ensure the former could exist without the latter destroying it. The helicopter banked toward Bagram Air Base, leaving the mountain behind. Through the window, Arya watched the sun rise fully over Afghanistan, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. It was Christmas morning, and somewhere back home, families were opening presents and drinking coffee and celebrating the holiday in warmth and safety. They would never know about the mountain, would never hear the story of what happened here. That was fine. Most of the work done by people like her happened in shadows, unknown and unacknowledged. But knowing that those families could enjoy their Christmas in peace, that children could grow up without losing their fathers to violence on a frozen mountain, that was reward enough. Arya closed her eyes and let the helicopter's vibration lull her towards something resembling rest. She was not sure what would happen next, whether she would return to active duty or resume her civilian work. But whatever she decided, she would make the choice without the crushing weight of unresolved guilt. Thomas would have wanted her to keep fighting, to keep protecting people, to keep being the operator he had believed she could be. Tonight, she had honored that wish. Tomorrow, she would decide what came next. For now, on this Christmas morning, simply being alive felt like miracle enough. 6 weeks later, Arya stood in the Pentagon briefing room while a 2-star general pinned the silver star to her dress uniform. The citation was carefully worded to protect operational security, but anyone with military experience who read it would understand that something extraordinary had occurred on that unnamed mountain in Afghanistan. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an armed enemy, the general read, his voice carrying the formal weight of military tradition, Captain Arya Hale distinguished herself by exceptionally valorous conduct in the face of overwhelming enemy forces. Despite sustaining serious wounds, Captain Hale voluntarily assumed a position of extreme danger to protect friendly forces under attack. Her expert marksmanship and tactical brilliance resulted in the elimination of more than 20 enemy combatants and the protection of 7 American personnel who would otherwise have been killed or captured. Her actions reflect great credit upon herself and the United States Army. Mason and the surviving members of his SEAL team stood at attention in the front row, their dress uniforms crisp and their faces solemn with respect. Chief Wolf had recovered enough to walk with only a slight limp, though doctors said he would carry shrapnel in his leg for the rest of his life. Franklin had required 3 surgeries but was expected to make a full recovery. After the ceremony, Mason approached her with a slight smile. "So, Captain, I hear JSOC has been trying to recruit you back to active duty. Any chance Night Wraith is coming out of retirement permanently?" Arya considered the question carefully. The nightmares about Thomas had not disappeared entirely, but they had softened into something more manageable. She could sleep through most nights now without waking in a cold sweat, could think about Syria without the immediate crushing guilt that had defined her for 3 years. "I'm thinking about it," she admitted, "but if I come back, it's going to be on my terms. I'm not interested in sitting behind a desk or working in a training environment. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it in the field, where I can make a difference." "I think JSOC would agree to pretty much anything you asked for at this point." Mason's smile widened. "Word has gotten around about what you did on that mountain. Half the special operations community is trying to get you assigned to their task force. You've become something of a legend." "I was already a legend," Arya said dryly. "I'm just deciding whether being a legend is worth the cost." Later that afternoon, she drove to Arlington National Cemetery and walked through the silent rows of white headstones until she found Thomas Brighton's grave. Snow had begun to fall again, dusting the marble with white powder that reminded her of that mountain in Afghanistan. She knelt beside his headstone and brushed away the snow so she could read his name clearly. "Hey, Thomas, sorry it's been so long since I visited. I've been dealing with some things, but I think you'd understand." The wind rustled through the bare trees, carrying the faint sound of taps being played at another funeral. Arya took a deep breath and continued. "I kept my promise. I didn't quit. Even when it would have been easier, even when I was sure I was going to die, I kept fighting. And I saved people. Thomas, 7 people who are alive because I remembered what you told me." She placed her hand on the cold marble, feeling the carved letters beneath her fingers. "I'm not going to forget you. I'm not going to pretend Syria didn't happen or that your death wasn't partly my responsibility. But I'm also not going to let that one failure define everything I am. You deserve better than to be remembered as the mistake that ended my career. You deserve to be remembered as the brother in arms who made me a better operator, a better soldier, a better person." The wind picked up, swirling snow around her in patterns that almost seemed deliberate. In that moment, she felt a sense of peace she had not experienced since that dusty courtyard 3 years ago. Thomas was gone, would always be gone, but his memory did not have to be a burden. It could be a reminder of what she was fighting for, the stakes involved when soldiers went into harm's way. She stood and saluted his headstone with precision that would have made any drill sergeant proud. "Sleep well, Thomas. I've got it from here." As she walked back through the cemetery toward her car, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she recognized. JSOC headquarters. She answered on the second ring. "Captain Hale? This is Colonel Davidson from Special Operations Command. I understand you might be interested in discussing a return to active duty. We have a situation developing that could use someone with your particular skill set. Would you be available for a classified briefing tomorrow morning?" Arya looked back at the rows of white headstones, each one representing a life given in service, then looked forward toward the gate and the world beyond. The choice was hers. She could return to civilian life, could consult and train and live safely away from the chaos of war. Or she could step back into the shadows, could be the weapon that protected those white headstones from multiplying unnecessarily. "I'll be there, Colonel." "Oh, 800? Perfect. And Captain? It's good to have Night Wraith back." She ended the call and continued walking, her pace steady and purposeful. The snow fell harder now, coating the world in white silence. Somewhere in Afghanistan, a mountain stood where 7 men had lived who should have died, where 1 woman had climbed into legend and come back down carrying redemption. Night Wraith had returned, and the darkness would never be quite as safe for those who preyed on the innocent, because somewhere in that darkness, a woman with a